I'm giving 3 lectures at this seminar, this workshop, and they have a theme together, which is the secret religions of the West. And the previous talk, to kind of tie into the idea of mere simulacrity, I discussed the idea of the negation of the real. And the idea of that talk was that if you're going to introduce a fake religion or get people to adopt an old religion that is a pretense to religion, or to get people to believe in the pretense to science, a fake or a counterfeit science, then the first thing you have to do is obliterate their ability to understand reality. Now, something you have to know and appreciate about these secret religions of the West is that they are not new, they are old, and they are well developed. I brought that up last time. You have to pretend, remember I asked you to pretend that there is another ancient world religion as well developed roughly as Judaism or Christianity that you just haven't heard much about, because there is. The reason that you haven't heard much about it is really simple. They make fun of scholars who go into this. You might as well study parapsychology. You might as well study ESP. You might as well study aliens. Scholars get made fun of in scholarly circles for pointing out that this stuff, mysticism, has been a part of the developments of the West.
In this episode, I'm going to fill in the blanks on the enemy that we saw illustrated in the last video. As I illustrated in that brief excursion through the history of the real war, the same enemy since the beginning of human history has been fighting, spreading, hiding, and resurging. If you're not comfortable with Judeo-Christian concepts of spiritual entities, and believe me, I'm not all that comfortable myself, others have described this enemy as a virus-like idea or a form of mental illness. Whatever you like, all I'm postulating here is the root cause at the center of the evidence we just looked at. In medicine, when you go to a doctor's office, they rarely will try to look at the specific bacteria or virus that may be infecting you in a lab as part of their diagnosis. We've all experienced this. You go to see a doctor when you got a flu bug or something. You know what it feels like. You may have a fever, stuffed, runny nose, congestion, aches and pains, other symptoms. The doctor will look at your symptoms, consider epidemiology, as in what's been going around, and then give you some medicine and tell you to come back in a week or 2 if you're not any better. The medicine they give you, or tell you to take over the counter, are palliative. That means they're meant to treat the symptoms, not the disease. If you get any antibiotics, they say that's preventative. That means they are giving it to you while your body is sick and weak to prevent any secondary infection. Antibiotics don't work on viruses, and that's called preventative. If they give you an antiviral, then that is the only thing that's given for the actual problem. You may end up taking pills and syrup and all kinds of things to help with the fever and the congestion and runny nose and sore throat and everything, except the actual virus that's causing the disease, the actual disease. And this is normal. It's totally normal. But it also means that most of the time, they don't truly know what's wrong with you. They're guessing. It's a pretty damn good scientific guess, backed by mountains of education and experience and paying attention to things like epidemiology, but it's still a guess. Except for the rare times they actually look at a part of you under a microscope, they never know exactly truthfully what's making you sick. The point is, the diagnosis is looking not at the problem, but how the problem affects the things around it, the symptoms. In astronomy or astrophysics, you can't see a black hole. Everyone accepts they're real, but no one's ever seen one. You can't. You literally can't see one. It absorbs everything. All light, all radio waves, x-rays, microwaves, anything that we can use to look at things far away and identify that there's a black hole, we can't use to see it. But through physics and math, and people a hell of a lot smarter than you or me, we can predict the existence of black holes. And then we got to figure out a way to verify it. Same as diagnosis in the example above, we look for how the black hole affects things around it. Instead of an infection by a virus making the body and cells and tissues around it react in a peculiar way, we look for stars and gases and other things that are behaving in a peculiar way in space. We can see them just like we can see snot. This is a valid principle used by medicine and science and a lot of other things. And this is what I mean by the root cause at the center of the evidence.
Gnosis is what's beneath these secret or esoteric religions that have been running the West. Science is also corrupted today. We don't have to look all the way back to the perversions of Athens. The science, COVID-19 policy, gender-affirming care. We can go on and on and on about the science and how science has been corrupted. So they can become corrupt. So the goal will be also to reveal how Gnosis is a parasite on faith and reason, It mimics them, it pretends to be them, it changes the language so that it uses the language of science, it uses the language of faith, but in reality what it does is it substitutes itself in their place, casts the spell of the wizard circle, and actually casts out the people who could call them out.
Well, if we look at everything I listed in the history of war example in the last video, we get a pretty good picture of an enemy and its traits and movements and characteristics in the same way. It is pretty close to call this thing Gnosticism, but it's even bigger than that. Our silly academia will say that Gnosticism didn't start until relatively later compared to the timeline I use going back to Adam and Eve and even before. And they're right. What we call Gnosticism did start relatively later, but it is Gnosticism, as in Gnostic ideas and philosophy, that are largely indistinguishable from our picture of this enemy. So I'm not even talking about a devil or Lucifer. That's not what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about some force or concept in reality that existed before what we call Gnosticism was officially started. But in all respects, we have to identify it, just like in every way we can't see or identify a black hole. It's the same thing. Gnosticism didn't invent this thing. They observed it, described it, and then called it truth. I'm not going to pretend to be an expert in Gnosticism. I know about what anyone else who has read a few books on it and did a few dozen research trips around the internet on the subject might know. That's not even the worst part of my lack of expertise. My small study of the subject makes it clear to me that at its root, Gnosticism is not a single ordered concrete body of knowledge. As I explain the key concepts below, I'll explain this further. But as I said in a paper I found in my research published at newadvent.org, a Catholic education and research organization, they say, owing to the multiplicity and divergence of Gnostic theories, a detailed exposition in this article would be unsatisfactory and confusing, to a certain extent even misleading, since Gnosticism never possessed a nucleus of stable doctrine or any sort of depositum fidei around which a varied developments and heresies or sects might be grouped. And this is what it looks like.
Faith isn't immune. Faith has to be done well. Heresies have arisen again and again and again and again. Heresies in Christianity up to that day. There have been Jewish heresies, and a lot of them are mysticism. Moses goes up on the mountain, comes down with the tablets, they have a golden idol. Already. It's like, hey, let's just screw up. Hey, where'd our boss go? He's talking to God. What do you want to do? I don't know, the exact wrong thing. How about that? He's not here. Let's go. And so Gnosticism has actually crept in quite explicitly. When we talk about capital G Gnosticism in a Christian context, we are actually talking about the Gnostic heresies. So those can become corrupted. There can be bad interpretations. There can be whack gospels that are not real introduced. There can be fake religious texts that are completely apocryphal. Mystery and mysticism follow religion around like a ghost or a demon or something. This is always happening. There were Jewish sects of esoteric mysticism traced back at least to the 2nd century BC. We have no reason to believe that they didn't go back further. Humans like to get mystical. The problem is that once reason and faith start to get corrupted, they can't keep Alexandria out, because if they're getting into mysticism especially, they become Alexandria. The Gnostic parasite works like a Trojan horse. It comes up and says, hey, this is this great thing. It's like a gift to your society. It's extra knowledge. It's extra wisdom. It's faith beyond faith. It solves the mysteries of your faith. Blah, blah, blah. It puts knowledge where you're supposed to put trust. Or in the 20th century, probably going to a gas chamber.
In Gnosticism, what one puts effort into spiritually and how one is saved is through knowledge. In Christianity, the serpent told Eve that if she partook of the fruit, she would learn good and evil, knowledge, and then be like God. That's the bad thing. This set the standard for knowledge-destroying faith. Gnosticism is thinly disguised pantheism. If you look through their literature, you'll see that they have, in the beginning there was depth, the fullness of being, the not being God, the first father, the monad, the man, the first source, the unknown God, or by whatever the name might be called. However, in Christianity, there's only one God. And I'm not even going to get into anything about Trinity doctrines right now. In Gnosticism, Sophia is a feminine figure, analogous to the human soul, but also simultaneously one of the feminine aspects of God. In Christianity, we're to worship no other gods, period. There is no feminine version. The inclusion of Mother Mary in Catholicism is one of the greatest controversies and battlegrounds in Christian thought and has been for hundreds of years. Gnostic salvation is not merely individual redemption of each human soul, but it's a cosmic process. It's the return of all things to what they were before. In Christianity, the first man, Adam, created a separation from God that was reconciled 2,000 years ago by the death of Christ. In Gnosticism, our efforts to acquire the secret special knowledge is the religious life of the Gnostic. In Christianity, learning to trust God and faithing and letting Him lead is the religious life of the Christian. In Gnosticism, authority is derived from secret teachings from wise teachers, human or spirit, and making contact with those spirit teachers through meditation, experimentation, and ritual. In Christianity, authority is from God, period. Everything in the Bible is a record of times when God, in various ways, including through the incarnation of Jesus, interacted with man. And following those revelations, we try to preserve that authority through various means prescribed by God. In Gnosticism, whatever soul or spark they describe that man has is an actual piece of that which they call their God. Through their religious practices and knowledge, they want the spark to rejoin the main source. In Christianity, God breathed into Adam a life that is of a separate substance and is recreated by the born-again experience, but at no time is man elevated to be the same as God. Gnosticism is highly ritualized. Christianity, although sometimes rituals may be performed, they have no basis in the New Testament framework. There are no rituals in Christianity. Gnosticism is highly experimental. Part of the religious life of the Gnostic is to seek knowledge through studied research and experimenting. In Christianity, God seeks you out and provides for your spiritual growth through a domata, or teaching pastor. It is a relationship with a living God, Jesus, that you approach the same way you would approach a relationship with any person. In Gnosticism, there's a social aspect of exclusion based on having the secret knowledge. You got to be in the circle or in the club. In Christianity, we don't judge. We give Caesar what is Caesar's, and there's an element of evangelism. The purpose is to spread the good news. We don't save anyone ourselves. One of the greatest threats and dangers to Christianity is through the social element, since as society breaks down, as we are seeing in society today, we aren't able to have relationships with others, so how are we going to have a relationship with Jesus? Gnosticism is parasitical by nature, and I'm not talking bad about them. They actually call this themselves. This is a characteristic described as an eclectic adoption of buffet-style components from any or all other religions or cultures, but also intentionally integrating into other religions and cultures as a form of hostile infiltration, with obvious results you can see by just looking around at where we are today.
Gnosis is a parasite on faith and reason. It mimics them, it pretends to be them, it changes the language so that it uses the language of science, it uses the language of faith, but in reality what it does is it substitutes itself in their place and actually casts out the people who could call them out. That's why communists always have to purge the bourgeois sciences. That's why the Nazis had to purge Jewish science. They had to get rid of it because it's stuff that could have called them out. These are uncomfortable topics, but it's very important to understand. Like we talked about last night, is it negates the real, creates a simulation or a simulacrum of whatever it's occupying, takes its place, and it plays to faith and reason to mystify what those things mean. And if you actually listen, Marx talks constantly about how everything that sounds religious is a mystification of reality. And he's going to demystify reality with his scientific theory. Demystify. Whatever he says they're not doing, that's what they're doing. So in other words, he's mystifying reality.
What all this long list means, or rather what I mean to point out, is that there's a definite list of characteristics that we can A, identify as the enemy throughout history, and B, identify as the core principles of this Gnosticism, Theosophy, communism, feminism, woke progressive ideologies, mental illness, academia, or early church division. So essentially, to this enemy, the goal is to get us to embrace the idea that man is God, knowledge is supreme, and magic is real. Basically, they believe that man and the efforts of man are the pinnacle of authority. Clearly, at its root, the characteristics existed before Gnosticism, possibly back to Exodus, and was called such, and is about as extreme and opposite to the very heart of Christianity as one could possibly conceive. Yet right now, as we speak, there are dozens of videos on YouTube explaining how the two are the same. Gnosticism is either a part of Christianity or the secret truth of Christianity. There are academics you can find and read right now in Christian academia trying to teach and prove this very concept openly. Great arguments are made about it. In fact, a recent study said that over 60% of Americans believed that Gnosticism was the same or a part of Christianity when they were asked. These beliefs also parallel the arguments and divisions in the early church, and in the division between Judaism and Christianity of the same time period as the Pharisees. They had embraced several Gnostic ideas, in practice if not in name. This means that these same characteristics can be found in the classic faith versus works arguments. There's a YouTube channel I've been watching for the past year called What If Alt Hist. I really think this young man is one of the most intelligent people on YouTube currently. During the past 6 years or so, it became fairly clear that the vast majority of YouTube creators could be measured with the twin axes of research and analysis. I mean, obviously, I'm not talking about the vapid personality cult videos. I'm talking about the actual informative videos that I always thought was the point of YouTube in the first place, as an early beta tester. It became fairly obvious to me, especially as we entered this strange world of hyperpolarized politics the last 6-7 years or so, that some people were great researchers and others were excellent analysts. Many were decent with both, but overall it did not appear that it was a foregone conclusion that if someone was good with one, they would automatically be good with the other. This young man behind What If Alt Hist is one of the few that I believe is good at both. Astonishingly, but every now and then, I meet someone very young who restores my hope amidst all the examples of youth that make people despair for the future. As I was putting together this series, in fact, I was in the middle of doing the video editing on the previous video, he released a video titled Understanding Modern Civilization. He's fond of predictive models of history and explains the concepts very well. The first 50 minutes or so, he explains the concept of modernity and does a great job of explaining how we get here. Then he takes a sharp turn and links up modernity and its drawbacks that he spent the last 45 minutes talking about and point to Gnosticism. It blew my mind. It was an excellent analysis, and I think he understands the things I'm trying to get across here. It actually cheered me up amidst the depressing writing on these topics to know that other people are aware of this issue. Anywho, excellent analysis and research, strongly recommended. In fact, all of his videos are of this quality, and if anything I'm discussing here is sparking your interest or concerns, a valid means of learning more is to see other researchers' view on the subject. Another excellent analysis you might want to check out is a 2-hour video by James Lindsay titled The Gnostic Parasite, which you can find on the New Discourses website and YouTube channel. I'm still writing my videos on how the term conspiracy theory has been weaponized, including the psychiatric industry and DSM-5, including language to declare a person mentally ill for this version of wrongthink. I've got the receipts and sauce. The point being, all this talk about this enemy is not just conspiracy. There's actually a great deal of paper and evidence supporting these claims. I can't explain it any simpler. I've spent a lot of time now in these videos giving you contrasting examples, and those that I gave are the tip of the iceberg. Just what I came up with off the top of my head. To really seal the deal and hopefully provoke a little gestalt, I'm now going to turn back to academia.
How do you get from being an ancient religion to the secret one of the modern world? The answer is that Gnosticism survived under the surface for millennia in secret philosophic associations. We have lots of proof for this, and keep in mind this was a very religious society, where all educated people thought about religion. The heretics the Catholic Church were fighting, like the Cathars, were Gnostics, and alchemy had a big Gnostic element to it. The kinds of people who are on the outcasts of the Church, or the educated humanists, were the sort of people who were also studying Gnosticism. Hegel used a lot of Gnostic terminology and has a very Gnostic worldview. This is something we've written out of the histories, but the 19th century was a big period of fascination with the occult. I have a bunch of books which show how the revolutionary and modernist thinkers were people who were also very steeped in the occult.
We have records of Karl Marx himself talking about dreams of being given a great gift by Satan. He was a Satanist and hated God. Look this stuff up. I'm not making it up.
Saul Alinsky, the biggest leftist American organizer of the 20th century, literally dedicated his book to Satan. Hitler talked about how he felt he was pushed along by a great destiny and spiritual force, which was irrespective of the Christian God. Imagine if the Gnostics were to win, what it would look like. Gnosticism was always a secret religion, in that there was no separate Gnostic church, but there would be Gnostic sects of other religions, such as Judaism, Christianity, or the previous religions. So it would make sense that the Gnostics would push a Gnostic worldview through other ideologies like liberalism, Marxism, or fascism, and not say they're Gnostic. And then as they grow, they treat their worldview as self-evidently true and don't explain it because that's how they view it.
In America and Western Europe, the latest attack of Gnosticism on the authority of God started with Theosophy about 100 years ago. Pretty much everything we are having a problem with now in society and politics and academia and the news media starts from that point. And one who has greatly impacted the attack through academia is John Dewey, the guy behind the Dewey Decimal System. He started a movement in education way back. Then, which he called progressive education, and with the term experimentalism, almost straight out of the traits of Gnosticism called experimentalism. Now, in a previous video in the series I've been doing on pistis, the word translated as faith in the New Testament, I try to describe how, in attempting to understand what this word means, our very language defeats us. What I'm about to get into is a little more expansion on this point, and if you'd like to hear that part of this concept, it's in the video entitled Chapter 4, The Lie of Faith. Links are above and at the end of this video. Philosophy is always out there asking these crazy questions, like this one. Is there any sound in the woods if no one is around to hear it? If someone says no, how can you prove them wrong? It's hard to prove that there's a sound in the woods when there's no one there to hear it. And if you go to listen, then you're there to hear it. And then there's nobody in the woods. And far more of the world, for example, is caught up in this kind of philosophical frame that produces the religions of the Far East, which is based upon a theory of reality that includes the idea that we don't exist, that we are all appearance, not reality. The ultimate reality is in a different plane. So undefinable, they won't even give it a name. They call it the that behind all that. The Vedanta philosophy and many types of Buddhism are actually based on this way of thinking. The Vedanta philosophy grows from this frame. All forms of Buddhism, both the northern and eastern streams, all grow out of this view of reality. The education system of America grows out of that view of reality as well, adopted by John Dewey, called experimentalism. They put a propaganda name on it, progressive education, but at its core, it's based upon the view that you don't have any ultimate reality. Struggling to preserve self is a very limited benefit. You have no more existence than a wave in the sea. A lead exponent of experimentalism and progressive education back in the 40s postulated the ontology of experimentalism based on the analogy that we're like waves in the ocean. According to this, our existence is temporary, and our only impact is the influence that our actions have on the larger whole. The meaning of a wave is simply to be a wave, and we should enjoy our existence while it lasts. When faced with obstacles, it's our goal to overcome them and continue moving forward. This postulation forms the foundation of American education now. Parents just go on trusting their kids during their formative years to a school system based on this philosophy. According to this viewpoint, there is no such thing as the immortality of the soul. The idea of an afterlife is mere speculation, and the ocean's continually producing waves is the only form of it. Furthermore, there are no ultimate truths or lasting facts to be found in the world. The most consistent thing about the ocean is it's always changing. The only thing that never changes in this philosophy of experimentalism is that everything changes. There are no absolute truths except for the absolute truth that there are no absolute truths. This statement may sound like a joke, but it's actually in the philosophy of experimentalism. It's based on the field of epistemology, which deals with how we can know things. So follow me as I guide you through this intricate path of philosophy real quick. Epistemology refers to the study of knowledge, theory, as well as metaphysics, and the fundamental aspects of reality. Ontology, which is a branch of metaphysics, posits that the ultimate nature of reality is being. Epistemology is concerned with what is knowable and what can be known. It divides the entire world in two categories. Each and every one of us, whether you realize it or not, you're either in a state of realism or you're in a state of idealism. Now, it's important to note that when I use the term idealism, I'm not referring to it in the common emotive sense of having lofty lofty ideals or being an idealist. Rather, I'm using it in this philosophical and epistemological sense. Idealism and realism have fundamentally different views on reality and what can be known about reality. You must choose one of these frames of reference. You're not even aware of it when it happens. Your very language captures you before you even realize there's a distinction to be made. Before you even realize there's a decision to be made on the reality you want to embrace, it's embedded. Your language is determined by your cultural mindset, and that captures your frame of reference as either idealistic or realistic. The concept of a reality that is made up of unchanging persons who are in relationships with other unchanging persons is considered to be an illusion, and that's the philosophy of idealism. This is because idealists believe that reality is not composed of fixed and unchanging entities, but rather is constantly changing and evolving. To an idealist, the very idea of unchanging persons in fixed relationships with other unchanging persons seems incompatible with the dynamic and fluid nature of reality. Therefore, they see this kind of reality as an illusion, rather than an accurate representation of the world we live in. To the idealist, all that exists are relationships. We're merely focal points for relationships, despite believing ourselves to be independent entities. Any philosophy teacher can recognize that this can sound foolish to those who are not well versed in the subject. This frame of reference is demonstrated by our very language. You cannot describe any person or object without describing a relationship you're having with it. No matter how hard you try, we can never fully describe ourselves or others without reference to our relationships and interactions with one another. The message is that our identities and experiences are complex and multifaceted and cannot be reduced to simple descriptions or labels. No matter what you say, you cannot describe me in a way that you can articulate without a relationship. You can't describe yourself that way. There's nothing you can articulate that is not described in terms of relationships. Try it. All you can do is describe relationships. That's what they're teaching you at school. The kids should stay home. The realist says, I don't care. I don't care whether I can describe myself or not. I am me. I ain't you. For which one of us should thank God. I don't care whether I can put it into words. Reality is things or ones or otherness, having a relationship with otherness, and the relations are between these entities. The idealist says, no, all you can describe is the relationship. Forget the entities. There ain't nothing but relationships, and if you change one relationship, it changes all of them. That's also the origin of pantheism, which finds God in all reality. But the view is already there because our language already captures our mental development. Here's an example. Our language has the verbs change and the nouns and pronouns stay essentially unchanged. Here's an example as it was taught to me. You've got I run home, I will run home, I was running home, I would like to have run home, I think I will run home, I am home. Only the verbs change. The subjects and objects, the nouns, I and home, remain unchanged. So our thought patterns grabbed our minds when we first learned the language. Interestingly enough, in the mind of God, in the fullness of time, I believe that it's not the least of the reasons that what he sent forth his son in the fullness of time means is that he picked a time when a precise realism language like Greek ruled the mind of the world. For his word, as it became incarnate and eternal in the eons to come, the written word had to be as precise as the languages could possibly be, to be not corrupted or at least minimal corruption by the prince of this world. So out of the options of all languages, I think God picked a time when a precise language like Greek ruled the world, or the known world anyway. Hebrew has a very small vocabulary and has the same kind of confusion we have in English, where the word post can mean somebody sending a letter, or a fence post, or a box of cereal, or any other innumerable meanings that must be interpreted by context. We have to have context. Greek has a precision unmatched that doesn't depend on the context. And in the fullness of time, when God would stamp his mind on a final revelation in the written word, Greek ruled. The epistemology of the Greek language is realistic, as is English. The epistemology of English is realistic. We have nouns and entities that remain unchanged, while the verbal action, which is the relationships, change. Sometimes nouns change too, but the main frame of reference of the English language is nouns don't change, verbs change. There once was a researcher at Stanford who found an Indian Navajo language that was completely fluid. When the verb changed, the nouns and the pronouns changed too. Everything changed. Any change in action, the subject and object, the words change. As you can imagine, even though it's alien to our mind frame right now, if you grew up in a language frame where every time the relationship changed grammatically, the grammar changed from past tense to future, or when the verb changed, then all the other words changed too. Any action change the nature of the entity. This would make it easy for that tribe in that language frame to adjust to a view of reality where there are no ultimates. There's nothing fixed, everything's changing. One of the biggest complaints we hear about today is about how people are changing the meanings of words. They can't even decide on a definition for the word woman. What has to be the greatest accomplishment of Satan since Christ, and maybe in the history of mankind, Satan accomplished a coup of changing the educational system of this whole nation, based upon an epistemology of idealism that John Dewey's experimentalism adopted. And because of that, there is nothing but relationships, there are no absolute values, there are no absolute truths, and that's what we're learning in school. Therefore, education should not learn about facts, because facts will change. What education should do is prepare our kids to cope with change, which will never change, namely the fact that change is constant. Therefore, since change is constant, values and facts and truths will change, and change will always be with us. The people embraced by this modernistic Gnostic thought don't even blink an eye about changing things like pronouns, and can't even understand why someone might be opposed to it. So education prepares you to cope with change, but it does not prepare you to change yourself to adjust reality. Reality is constantly changing. There are no absolute proofs, so don't be bothered with the facts. They don't get bogged down with Plato and his eternal forms and conformity to him. They don't get bogged down with religion and its immortality and the unchanging soul that never dies. Facts that come from God and absolutes don't exist. They can't even understand or be compassionate with anyone's confusion or objection to it. It's all poetry and fancy and fabrication. What exists is you, the wave in the sea of change. You're educated to preserve your status quo and well-being. You learn to cope with change in a way that satisfies and perpetuates you and your truth. Therefore, you have to learn to solve problems that impede your progress, your sense of well-being, your satisfaction, and your happiness. Because that's all you've got. When this wave dies, it's gone. Therefore, you have to learn to serve yourself and perpetuate yourself. Truth is what works for you. Value is what preserves you. Look up what the word for self is in Latin. It's ego. It's all ego. This enemy that is characterized by these characteristics we're identifying, and I am calling Gnosticism for simplicity's sake, are also the core idealistic principles of theosophy and communism and feminism and progressivism and all this woke garbage, all of it. It's just ego. It's pride, the chief of all sins. In big ways and little ways, you take the roles of God. The authority of God shifts to you. To those captured by this modern Gnosticism, the test of truth and value is what makes you happy. In the end, your happiness, your feelings, your self-perpetuation justify any means to accomplish it. Truth becomes relative as reality is relative. Whatever gets you on your way. What this enemy had accomplished to win over the minds from Leipzig University in Germany through the State Teachers College at Columbia and New York, and then out through the Ivy League colleges, and then Stanford and Cal, leading the way on the West Coast, and Reconstruction and education was taken. All this progressive education, experimentalism, idealism philosophy of John Dewey and others, admitted humanists and theosophists, including Rudolf Steiner, who could fill a dozen of these videos by himself, and his influence on Hitler, by the way, all of it seen as a moral imperative to change things away from our traditional view of what reality was. It was morally imperative that they did it, and eternal things just went out the window. It turns out the new math really was demonic. Thank God you are born in a frame that prepares you with a language frame of realism before you are yet educated in the alien frame of idealism. Your education then defies the very language structure in which you are learning your skills in language. The most effective cancer they have is the one where you are taught to preserve yourself selfishly. You're taught me first. This sounds like a conspiracy theory, but people have been lamenting it for years. For 40 plus years that I'm aware of, scholars have been saying how they found it intolerable but couldn't do anything about it. The progressive education and experimentalism that taken over the secular education system of America. In the 80s, it started to encroach into Christian education in churches. It's already come, and it's hard for the churches to do anything about it. Most churches today are selling God to me first Christians. They think God is acceptable to you if he helps you along your way. God becomes just another weapon in your arsenal of self-serving behavior. A good example of this is the Enneagram. It's so pervasive in both Catholicism and Christianity that exorcists have been warning us about it in print. Christianity has been put on a smorgasbord table on the same level as all the other religions, serving you better, but also alternate lifestyles and formulas. The criteria still is me first, what works best for me. If I had been born in an idealist frame and accepted the truth of Christ's revelation, the language that God chose to inscribe the living word was Greek, which is the realism frame. It uses word conjugations to describe the relationships, but the root objects don't change. And it's taken nearly 100 years for progressive education to finally get to a point where we have to either give up our language and Christianity or we're going to be replaced. They're already putting together a replacement idealism framed version of Christianity that fits with progressive changes. If you've been listening and it cannot be proven, deduced from the authority of Christ's resurrection and the stance on his official written document placed there by his words, written by those who listen to him, I have to remain committed to the realist position myself. I mean, progressive education is full of crap. You cannot separate the method from the philosophy. And if this self exists internally, then the question becomes important. What will you give in exchange for your soul? All you me-firsters out there. The scripture comes along like a battering ram and says, if you gain the whole world and lose your soul, you've lost it all. Now here comes the church. It's got a group of subconscious self just like we do. Also, every member thereof with their wants, ideas, opinions, and desires. Sometimes they cluster together a little bit on a shared want beyond the desire of the united subconscious desire to serve God. And they promote, or you can call it conspire, with one of these shared wants or desires that the smaller cluster shares. The church has the capacity for little pockets to conspire horizontally to get their wants and their wishes into the institutional group self and give it to serve their ends. I'm not putting on the kid gloves in this description, but anyone who's ever spent any time in a church knows this happens. It happens innocently. I think it would be nice to help the homeless, or single moms sure have it rough. Could be anything. The point is, a small section of the body of the church starts to identify itself as separate from within the church. As the self is corrupt according to deceiving desires, so does the church become corrupt according to deceiving centers of contention. Paul talks about it quite often in most of the books he writes. In fact, it's a major point of Galatians. In Romans 16, 17, 18, Paul says, "Mark those that cause contention among you. They're like a cancer. They'll infect the rest and cut them out." Every church has this subconscious mind, just as we have this subconscious mind in ourselves, with the desires driving it, composed of the individual units thereof. The plan of God does not want the self to become a slave to these wants. These wants are to be crucified. God's not trying to crucify yourself. He just wants these deceiving desires crucified. They're okay when under control. They become a problem when the desires become deceiving desires and the person surrenders to them, and the same is true of the church. Now, it ain't an analogy trying to explain God or his greatest creation, Adam, and his descendants are going to fall short. But God, who destined us, put our wants in us, put our capacities in us, made us as unique as a snowflake, never to be duplicated. God knows what's best for us and proved his love for us when he gave his son, the best of heaven, to give him the chance to start over with those that he chose. We're corrupt according to deceiving desires that deceive the self into thinking we ought to serve this dying flesh rather than God. This is the root of the concept of authority. And this enemy, with its characteristics of Gnosticism and all the others I've mentioned, celebrate this very same self-authority. Paul says all things are lawful, and he uses that word panta in the Greek, which means everything, no exception. All things are lawful, but not all of them are expedient. Not all of them build up Christ. The key part is all things are lawful, but I will not be brought into bondage to any of them. Likewise, usually, the trouble in the church starts with somebody having their idea of what their structure should be used for, and they seek support from others who feel the same as they do about some concept, and they become a cancer because this is a useful structure, and the whole organization is innocently sought to be brought into captivity to one of these little centers of want. It happens over and over. It's been happening for the last 2,000 years. If Paul was writing about it, he just didn't have television or the internet to contend with. The internet is the great unifier. For all of time, you may have had one person in town who had a certain idea or concept and lived their whole life alone with that desire. Now the internet comes and you have groups of them finding each other. That's how we got such powerful, small in size, minority groups using the powers of cancel culture that we see today. It's been happening in churches for 2,000 years. You can't go a week without hearing about some church somewhere adopting progressive woke ideas. Innocent as they may appear at the time, it's either an outreach to a specific population or risking a drop in your church's growth or numbers. God provides a way to handle it, just like he provided knowledge of it happening through Paul from the beginning. It's all about authority. I don't think the Christian churches and Christianity itself have ever faced the threat that it's facing today. In the next video, I'm going to give you some concrete facts about this threat and protecting yourself with authority.